Please, Cecilia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Carmela, for this wonderful introduction. And before I start, I would just like to thank you and Chiara and Rossella for inviting me to be part of this wonderful initiative. It's a pleasure. It's the field of health humanities is such a broad field. It is just really wonderful that you are planning this this perspective of the different, looking at the different arts in the context of the health humanities. So thank you very much for inviting me, and to our public, thank you very much for taking this time on your Wednesday afternoon to be with us. So today, this is a very brief introduction. So I'm just going to speak very briefly about the traditional, the very, very long traditional connection that there is between the humanities and healthcare. I'm also going to speak about narrative medicine as part of the health humanities. And then finally, I'm going to speak about how film, how we can use film within the context of narrative medicine, using the techniques and the methodology of narrative medicine. So just very, very briefly then, I will just talk about probably the connection between the humanities and healthcare is as old as both fields. Carmela, Maëlle, if you wouldn't mind the slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm going to refer to, we all know in all of our traditions, in all of our cultures, we have had many poet physicians. Here in Portugal, it's Miguel Torga, but Keats and Goldsmith are just some of the very, very well-known English poet physicians as well. But in 1945, Mary Lou MacDonald did a very interesting thing. She produced a book, she brought together, she edited a book with poetry by 100 physicians, where she had some of the well-known names like Carlos Williams, but many doctors that no one had ever heard of outside of their communities. But these doctors had written written poetry. And perhaps what was even more surprising than her compilation of this poetry was the response that this volume got in the medical community. Thomas Keyes wrote a 2-page review in the bulletin of the Medical Literary Association of MacDonald's volume. And in this 2-page review, he referred to 2 of the central reasons why poetry was so acceptable or accepted traditionally within the medical community. First of all, its capacity to permit the physician to express what had happened, what was happening in his life. And I quote in the first quotation, "It's not surprising that many physicians have contributed to the poetic literature. Whether it is an expression of their insight into the workings of the human mind brought about by their application of personal context or due to disciplined ability in general, it is hard to determine." But that they felt that the need to do this, or the capacity that poetry gave them the capacity to do this. This is what is interesting, as this was applauded. And then the second part refers to the long tradition of poetry as a transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. In the second part here, and I continue the quotation, "In the beginning, certainly, and long before the era of the printing press, poetry was of great practical importance. For being transmitted orally from generation to generation, it is a way of preserving our cultural heritage." So here it's poetry's function as a transmitter of ideas. When it comes to, I could just ask a technical question. Can you hear me all right, Carmela? Is the communication okay? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, everything is okay. We can hear you.
Okay, good. So then this brings us, we'll go very, very quickly up to the 20th century, and one of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, saw the first medical residency school being established in Johns Hopkins, and by William Osler. And William Osler was one of the figures who really believed intuitively. If we look at any of his writings, but in particular, an Alabama medical student, which was a text of his from 1896, he transferred to his students the great benefits that they would achieve by reading medical biographies and by reading the classics, because, and here I quote, he encouraged his students to read medical biographies and the classics, as these could help them understand the nature of their patients' illnesses. So he never negated, just as medical humanities and health humanities never negate the absolute necessity of technical expertise, but also introduced the understanding that to have an understanding of the patient and their condition, the classics could be absolutely essential. Curiously, so he was called to the UK in 1905, and he was to the post of Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford University, a post that he maintained until 1919. And curiously, referring to his British counterparts, he wrote, "It is remarkable how many physicians write poetry, or what passes as such. I have been told of a period in the history of the Royal College of Physicians when every elector or censor, as they are called, had written verse." And here, this is, I think, I really like this part where it says, "What passes as poetry," because here we are not talking about the production of, like verse by a poet, but rather the passive poetry, which speaks to the intuitive nature or the intuitive calling of poetry to the physician. From the 1970s onwards, you saw the opening or the beginning of medical humanities programs, first of all in American universities, later in the UK, and narrative medicine. And of course, the narrative medicine program was spearheaded by Rita Sharon in the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Columbia University, and has been the guiding light in the area of teaching and training in the area of narrative medicine. But before we leave, and before I speak about narrative medicine and the medical and the health humanities in a formal structure, I would just, if you don't mind, Rossella, to pass the next slide, I would just like to bring us a short poem. This poem, which was published in 2016 in, believe it, you may believe it or not, the Stat Online Medical Journal. This short poem, Rose, was written by Dr. Michael Shreve. Dr. Michael Shreve is a pediatrician pulmonologist, and he wrote this poem actually about 10 years after the event happened, after little Rose passed away, this little infant who died after his turn ended. And in the interview that accompanied this poem, he said that he wrote this poem so many years later from his medical notes, but also so to help himself make sense of the situation. And this was not something that happened immediately, but like I say, happened nearly 10 years afterwards. So Rose, red returns, heart rate stumbles, monitors worn, tiny lungs stiffen too much in her mother's arms, now comfortable. My turn ends, slipped out unnoticed when she went to heaven. Here, I think we see this tradition of the poet-physician that Thomas Keyes referred to when he spoke about the fact that poetry for the physician could give the avenue of expression that was needed to express what had happened in the practice and life. Okay, so now talking about narrative medicine and narrative medicine. As has been propagated by Rita Sharon and her team, and is being applied in many places around the world today, not just in Columbia University. Narrative medicine focuses around three tools that teach two skills, and the final one we would say is a way of being. So normally a narrative medicine workshop would take about an hour, and a piece of art or a poem or a text, a literary text is read. And the following tools are used in the reading of this text. You'll see when I speak about film, there can be different applications, but these three tools are used always. So there's close reading, which leads to the tool of close reading will lead to the skill of attention, of close listening. Creative and reflective writing, written in the shadow of the text or the poem or the painting or the excerpt of the film read. Read here being interpreted, which can lead to representation, which can give the participant representation skills. And finally, then close reading of this creative reflective writing, which leads to affiliation. Now, I would just like to look a little more closely at each one of these. So if you look at close reading, close reading, and from Sharon's perspective, close reading enhances the caregiver's ability to be more present in the moment and thus pay more attention to what is happening in the consultation. It also helps carers develop a listening ear, attentive to the nuance and atmosphere. This ear will be able to hear all aspects of the patient's message more effectively, whether these are transmitted verbally or non-verbally. According to Sharon, and now I quote, "Literary studies train students in close reading, in which the reader pays attention to multiple dimensions of a text at once: the plot, the genre, the imagery, temporality, the allusions to other texts, and the unsaid. Attentive listening to oral language is akin to close reading of a written text, and training in close reading is seen to translate into improved attention in listening to oral language." And what are the benefits of this listening ear? We can return to William Osler for the answer, because he is oft quoted as having said to his students many, many times, "Listen to the patient, he is telling you the diagnosis." So these are the benefits of this listening ear. But the listening ear that comes from close reading, it's this listening, not listening just to what is being said, but listening to the fact that the discourse may be transmitted, not just in the oral aspects, but in the phrase that's broken, in the laugh that hides embarrassment, in the looking away of the eye, because these are all things when we read a text, we are looking for nuance, we are looking for metaphor, we are looking for allusion, and we see when we close read a text that much of the great meaning of the text is not in what is said, but it is in what is not said. And this is what the participant in a narrative medicine workshop gains from this type of activity. Then if we go on to the reflective writing, with reflective writing, so then participants, after the close reading we finished, the close reading activity has been finished. Narrative medicine groups are run by a facilitator, not by a teacher. So there is an openness about them. But then when the close reading is finished, this facilitator selects a prompt. This prompt has normally been selected before, and participants write for 5 minutes freely and openly in the shadow of that text. They are free to write in prose, they are free to write a lyrical text. Often participants write straight text, but when they read it, it is actually a lyrical text. So, but there's freedom, it's written in the shadow, so they're thinking about the text, but they don't have to they don't have to write about the text. And what are the benefits of this reflective writing? It says, writing a free text written in the shadow of the text read allows the caregiver to represent his or her reactions to the text in a symbolic system, language built with intentionality. And much of medical professionals' life is spent writing reports, writing. So this capacity to represent accurately is very, very relevant. And here, this quote is from Sharon and her team's reflection on reflective writing. And why do they do it? To encourage and develop within the learners the skills to represent complex events or states of affairs so that they can be perceived and may be understood. I love this may be understood, because when we work with narrative, we always know that there may be more, you know, may be understood, and that, but also that they may be that it is possible for them to be understood. Based on the conceptual frameworks from aesthetic theory and narrative theory, we've come to understand some of the ground rules that might govern the utility and productivity of such writing in clinical practice settings, I beg your pardon. And then the final tool is close reading of the written text. So participants write this text on their own, and then in smaller groups. So narrative medicine groups are normally quite small. There would never be more than 20, but then the groups are divided into 4 or 5 participants, so that each participant gets the opportunity to read their text in this small group. And then there is a reaction, and this is close read in this context. And the close reading, it provides a reader to the participant, and technical recognition or evaluation of this creative work helps the participant to develop affiliation or a sense of being part and parcel of various caregiver-patient relationships. And there are many: caregiver with colleagues and teams, caregivers with institutions. It's not just caregiver and patient, but caregiver with all of these institutions. And as Sharon writes here, our methods result in sturdy affiliations with patients, with colleagues, and with communities and the public at large. And this is the purpose. It is not the purpose of the narrative medicine techniques is not just to develop attention and representation skills, but also to do this within the context of a whole groups of people, and also affiliation within oneself. And then so narrative medicine understands that patients and caregivers enter whole into illness. It's with their bodies, their lives, their families, their beliefs, their hopes for the future. And efforts to improve or help others, they cannot be seen in fragmented form, not linked to the deeper parts of the whole life. So Sharon argues that the principles of narrative medicine not only help caregivers understand better the dialogue of the sick, but also that the practice of medicine allows caregivers to maintain a sense of intimacy, even in situations of extreme physical and psychological pressure. So these are the principles and the concepts of narrative medicine. And then the application of narrative medicine to film. With the introduction of Health Humanities programs, one of the media that's used most or often is film, because film is popular, because film it's quite immediate in some ways, but on the other hand, and also many films have been made about health and healthcare. Like you have films like The Doctor or Witch, which can even show inappropriate attitudes of physicians, and so these films are often used in medical schools, so much so that you have teams like Matthew Alexander's team who have introduced this concept of cinemedication, where they've literally brought together tens of films and they've divided them into segments. And so like this segment is good for dealing with schizophrenia, this segment is good for dealing with compassion in medicine. And they develop scripts, and these are positive activities, but they're very immediate. They are looking at one particular thing at one particular time. Now, Maura Spiegel has written a lot about the use of film in narrative medicine and how we can use film using the same type of techniques. One of them is to work with whole films, because working with whole films, we have to be aware of how effects, how plots are developed, how events that happen at the beginning of the film will reflect in later events. And also, so that means that participants, if you work with film in this way, participants have to hold details that stand out in their minds so that they can reflect on why they connect with that point and contemplate the impacts of that particular point on the story as a whole. These are narrative skills that can truly impact on attentiveness to how stories are told in the real world, and thus help practitioners be more aware of what patients may be omitting in words but telling in other ways. Moreover, working with film, participants can become aware of how a teller's affect and physical actions may change in the telling of a story. So you can draw their attention to, within a whole story, how a look, how an expression, how an eye turned away can be telling another story. And all of these, and of course, all of these acquired skills are tremendously useful in the medical consultation. But because narrative medicine doesn't just focus on an excerpt that deals with schizophrenia, it focuses on the whole story. In narrative medicine, you can work with films that are not directly related to health, but that deal with other issues that are of the greater life. There can be a broader and more reflective basis of action. And this is one of the bigger differences. We bring these narrative skills, the understanding of narrative as it is developing in the story. Of course, for the close reading, we do need to introduce the techniques of close reading. So we need to introduce visual literacy so that participants can know what to look for. But the emphasis is on the development of the whole narrative. Later on in June, we will work with the film together. Unfortunately, because it's an hour and a half seminar, we'll have to look at excerpts. But the film I have chosen, it's Making Rounds by Muffy Myers. The excerpts in this film, they're like short films. So we can use this narrative skills that I was talking about, even though it will be with like 5-minute excerpts instead of with a whole film. So I look forward to meeting you then and talking about film in more detail. So thank you very much.
Just a moment. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. Thank you, Cecilia, for your excellent introduction, of course, and also for sharing with us this interesting method with film applied to narrative medicine. The method is also the connection with our second speaker, a different kind of method applied to narrative medicine. Our second speaker, that is Rossella Riccobono, a friend, but also a retired scholar of the University of St. Andrews, specialized in poetry and modernism, that will talk us about poetry and medicine, and in particular about the end of life and palliative care. So if Rossella, you are ready, I can start with your presentation.
Sure.
Yes, one moment.
I'll wait until it's, okay.
Yes, can you see the presentation?
Yeah. Okay, well,
Okay.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody, and welcome. And thank you very much, my love, for the presentation, the kind presentation. Just coming out and following from Cecilia's presentation, I'm going to talk about the healing value of poetry. And I just wanted to explain just very briefly, add a couple of words on, how my interest in poetry as therapy has been put together in the last few years. And basically see how then I've applied that to some medical tools which I've used in some of my research. So my interest in poetry as therapy originates from obviously my experience as a scholar and researcher in further education. Since the early 90s, when I did a PhD in poetry at the University of Edinburgh. And also I've actually led a bit of a double life. I was also practicing actively as a complementary alternative therapist for a number of years. And so I've married the two interests. And in the last few years, I have developed into my research this idea of using poetry as therapy or poetry, in order to promote healing in clients or in patients, in groups of volunteers, for example. And so in a way, I've used and ideated one medical tool from the field of narrative medicine, and then applied it, to real people, to real groups. And so I'm basically just showing an application of, what Cecilia was saying. I'm actually showing an application. More than interested in poetry written by physicians, I'm actually interested in poems written by people that were ill, in order to create some text, whether they are reflective and reflexive writing or new creative writing, that then can be sort of reconduced to new medical students, for example, new therapists, in order to train them. So it starts from an aesthetic viewpoint, and then it moves to creating texts or notes, for example, that can be re-educational for within the field of narrative medicine. So I just wanted to give a very brief, so basically the text I use and put together in my research are creative writing, close reading, and also reflexive writing. Just very briefly, a history of poetry therapy or poetry as therapy. If we go back to the Egyptian times, Egyptian physicians used to actually write words on papyrus paper, and they used to then dissolve it with some liquids and get their patients to actually drink the liquidized words. So much was their belief that the word can heal. If we also look at the Roman physician Soranus in the 1st century AD, he used to prescribe tragedy for his manic patients, and he used to prescribe comedy for the depressed patients. And this actually is not surprising that Apollo, one of the Roman gods, was actually the god of medicine as well as the god of poetry. So much entwined the two fields were, as Cecilia was actually telling us before. We can look at other physicians that actually regarded poetry as a healing tool. So Eli Griefer in the States, in New York, he developed some poem therapy groups in the hospitals he was working at between the 1930s and the 1960s. Then Dr. Leedy wrote the first book in the discipline, which was entitled Poetry Therapy in 1969. And then from the 70s, we've got the Poetry Therapy Institute, which was established. And Arthur Lerner wrote the volume Poetry in the Therapeutic Experience. In the 80s, then they started to train and have guidelines and certifications for poetry therapy practitioners, part of the National Association of Poetry Therapy. And in the last 40 years, more work was done, especially in the US, on from 1983, for example, they established the International Federation of Bibliopoetry Therapy, training practitioners in that type of therapy. So as well established as it is in the US, it's actually in the UK, it's only in the last maybe 15 to 20 years that poetry therapy has started to gain some attention. And as was expressed by Adams in 2013 and Pennebaker in 2007. So next slide, please, Maela. Oops, there should be some animation there. Yeah. So expressive and reflective writing for health and well-being is gaining increasing recognition in the UK and has an evidence base which, among other positive outcomes, demonstrates increased emotional regulation, self-soothing and self-management skills. And even if you click again on the slide, Gibel Chavez stressed that poetry therapy awakens our minds and spirits, soothes our hearts, and even transforms the course of our lives. So it's pretty powerful. And then looking at a definition. So I was looking for a definition that can encapsulate poetry therapy. And I found Nicholas Matzes from 2003, who says that poetry therapy, the use of language arts in therapeutic and community building capacities, includes bibliotherapy, storytelling, and narrative. So it's really quite broad. So actually tonight in this paper, I really want to go closer to one text in particular, which is poetry in verse, rather than poetry as the literary word, which is what poetry therapy usually refers to, and storytelling. So if you click again, so sorry, go one back. Yeah, so I'm going to give an example of an application of a tool I devised back in 2015 while I was on my sabbatical, and which was basically devised to promote well-being in groups of medical patients. At least that was the initial scope of the research. So what we're going to do tonight is we'll look at both poetry and storytelling together as healing experiences. So I'm starting from a sentence that Cecilia mentioned in her paper, and I would like from there to actually open a window which is a little bit closer to what I'm doing, but also connected to what she was saying, just to give a little bit of fluidity between our papers. So what she said was narrative medicine and the medical humanities defend that reflective contact with literary texts can facilitate carers' capacity to comprehend patient stories because this enhances caregivers' capacity to develop a listening ear. And this is key for me because the two words that are really central and that will allow me to share a little bit more of you know what I'm working on is are two words: stories and listening. So listening to stories, and again more closely listening to patient stories, but also listening to each other's stories. So in short, my interest in poetry as therapy and the healing value of poetry is all about using poetry to elicit storytelling. So let's unpack a little the role of a therapist in complementary alternative therapies, also known as CATs. So the relationship between a therapist and the patient, a client in the private practice, but for brevity we'll keep to patient, takes a central stage in the therapy because rather than prescribing medication or treating the patient's condition from a position of knowledge in a vertical type hierarchy, CATs pivot around a peer horizontal relationship between therapist and patient, where the main role of the therapist is that of eliciting and listening to the patient's story, and on the basis of that story, facilitate the patient to self-awareness. It is a story that incorporates not only symptoms connected to their health condition, but also life events that may be connected to the triggering of those symptoms, and other factors that may be maintaining the root cause of the very same ill condition active. In this way, both the therapist becomes aware of the patient's lifeline, so the patient's story broken down into single events, just to understand a little bit more what's going on in the patient's life. But also the patient is able to reassemble these single events together of his and her life in a holistic way, and take control of it by giving it a voice and a narrative, and by doing so, assuming a performative role in his, her, rationalizing the condition of illness, and also recovery through the therapist's advice and recommendations. And usually what I deal with is more like talking therapies or therapies where you sit down with the client and listen to them, you know, you try and get them to tell you their story. Of course, you know, if there's any physical intervention that maybe like acupuncture or other, you know, deep tissue massage, you know, they're less relevant because there's hands-on therapies. It's really more, you know, nutrition therapy, counseling, and other types of therapies where you talk, basically. So this is the case, of course, unless there is a real medical intervention needed to the patient. So the talking therapies, that they can become adjuvant rather than, you know, central to the cure. So let's go back then to, so therefore recounting one's life story becomes therapeutic when people find an ideal listener who is able to record and repeat their story to others, even if only in therapeutic and medical notes. And when the story is activated or recounted in a relational and performative way, so the story may be recognized as useful and as potentially some legacy for others. So what do I mean when I refer to the performative nature of storytelling? So first of all, in the context of therapy and in the context of, you know, what I've done with my research, the poetic text must be read aloud. So silent reading of poetry is fine and perfectly therapeutical, and is that what we really know in modern times more than in ancient times? Poetry always used to be read aloud. But, you know, silent reading of poetry is therapeutic in a relaxing and pacifying way. But what we're looking at here is not a pacifying way, but is looking at performative and therefore relational. And relational, since the relationship between patient and therapist is central in the cure, you know, the intervention of poetic texts must be relational and therefore read aloud. The cure, in basically in few words, must be relational. However, when a poem is read aloud to a patient or a group of patients, it is then that the text takes full shape as a vehicle of connection, voice to ear, between therapist and patients. And it is then that as the text becomes voiced, just like a theatre play, that the room within which the text is read aloud, in Adriana Cavarero's words, turns into a theatre of reciprocity, where therapist and patient can truly meet in a relational exchange. So poetry read aloud, as well as prose or plays read aloud, entails an actor, the reader, and the public, the patient, and therefore it establishes a relationship which is sensorial and physical, so sound waves from mouth to ears, as well as emotional. The text read elicits emotional reactions from the audience and bonds the parties in the locutionary act. We will see, however, why poetry has a more powerful effect in therapy because of its very linguistic nature and structures, because of the figures it uses, the sound patterns, and also because they are relatively short texts. The strength of therapy lies in the relationship of exchange between therapist and patient, where both are in a journey of trust and safety, and both walk together along a healing path, which is activated by the act of listening and storytelling. A therapist's strongest attribute is that of listening and encourage the patient to tell his, her story, which allows him, her to voice their experience and gain self-awareness regarding their ill condition. Like Cecilia was saying before, they're actually the best people to diagnose themselves, basically, through their story. So another term that needs to be unpacked is reciprocity, which, if applied to the relationship between therapist and patient, indicates the potential therapeutic effect, not only on the patient, but also on the therapist, It is indeed this reciprocity which strengthens the power of the relational value of poetry therapy, but also its reflexive dimension. So reflexive is, you know, returning basically to the agent of the speech, of the text, for example, writing to the author in this case. So part of the duty of a therapist, that of keeping him herself connected and reflexive on the interactions with his, her patients, so that, and then if you could click, Carmela, on the slide, so that emotions do not overwhelm the therapist, but can be processed healthily after each encounter with the patient. And then the next one, the therapist becomes aware of all verbal and non-verbal cues the patient is communicating, so that the following encounters can be improved. And 3, the interaction is reflected upon for what concerns rapport, so that possible limitations can be addressed and successes can be implemented more regularly. So the result of this continuous self-reflection on the part of the therapist usually takes place in journals, whose narrative forms text that can be closely read thereafter, analyzed, and form part of the body of literature of narrative medicine, and can be used to re-educate more therapists later on. So to recap, the key words identified until now to study the healing power of poetry are the following: story, listening, relational, performative, reciprocal, and reflexive. And keeping these in mind, I'd like to explore a therapeutic tool I designed in 2015, and which I have used in some experimental groups of volunteers, either within the context of the hospice or during workshops with the general public. So a few words about this tool, which was actually called PROSE, Poetry as Unifying Shared Experience, which I designed after taking a course in 2015 at the Readers Group organization in Liverpool, where I qualified as a Read to Lead facilitator. That got huge research there of community building, for example, through their methods. It's actually really, and it's connected with the psychology, kind of Department of English and Psychology. So after that, I applied some of their method to my own research and designed PROSE. The method includes reading a poetic text aloud. So reading can be facilitated by the leader or the therapist or any of the participants, you know, because we actually are in the same room as peers rather than in a vertical hierarchy, then you know, we don't have you know, the patient can be a leader and the therapist can actually be a listener. You know, we share in an equal way. And then eliciting shared discussion around the characters in the poem. So the poem is generally chosen in connection with a specific theme, is structured and narrated from the first person perspective, and is easily understood as a story. So this means that reading a poem aloud is very similar to reading a short story aloud, only the rhythm of the text is respectful of rhymes and other poetic figures that make remembering certain words or figures or tropes easier than it would be in a prose piece, where you're actually more interested maybe in the plot. This also allows for the reading to be mindful of a natural breathing rhythm. In turn, this promotes natural relaxation of the body and the meditative sense of calm and concentration. We will go more into detail into the various reasons why the poetic text can be so powerful, or well, the poetic text read aloud can be so powerful in our next lecture in April. But, you know, to continue slightly more, the poem being generally a short piece can be read in its entirety and several times to allow people to conflate it into a real life scene in whose situation or characters the participants may be able to resonate with. This may elicit spontaneous storytelling of situations that may have occurred to them or to other people they know. In turn, this connects the participants emotionally in shared discussion and turns the whole event into a theater of reciprocal listening and storytelling. So PROSE is a tool that allows for a real pause, that is the suspension of therapeutic medical routine to allow therapists, volunteers, patients to all sit around the table with no hierarchy, but as peers. In that pause, in that time out to read, all participants, irrespective of their official role within the clinic and institution, meet as people and share life stories through the mediation of poetry. In this manner, they're able to connect as human beings beyond their condition of health or illness. And therefore, whether they are ill or whether they're healthy, no one is stigmatized or marginalized in a small group, for example. They're all peer, they're all the same. In the sessions, if the sessions are either audio or video recorded, evaluated and analyzed, that can be closely read for improvement of services, better ability to listen to patients, and to also, facilitate education of young therapists and medical students. So there was an instance, for example, when I was going to start a course at St. Andrews University in the medicine department, for first-year students, who I was working with a clinical psychologist who was saying, well, first-year students are still young and they haven't put up a wall yet between themselves and their patients, because they haven't had brutal experiences, for example, of going to hospitals and having to protect themselves from too much emotion. So first-year students are actually the best people that should actually take these courses, just to learn, to relate basically to patients in a more human way. Or in a human way, in a humane way. I'm not saying that doctors are not human or are not humane, but in a more humane way, without barriers, and learning maybe to be on the defense because they have to protect themselves from the experience. So, conscious of my time, I'd like to conclude very briefly with an example of how the tool was tested within a workshop for the general public back in April 2018. A workshop which was hosted by myself and the PROSE project research assistant, Fiona Gilmore. I hope you don't mind, she's here with us tonight. She was a wonderful person to work with, so it's lovely to see her here. Within the On the Rock Festival at the Beecher Theatre in the town of St. Andrews, Scotland. So the workshop was attended by 12 volunteers from the festival general public. Ages were between 20 and 74, and people were both males and females and from all walks of life. They included undergraduate students, postgraduate students, retired people, a doctor, widow, and a creative writer. The text was read and discussed. The title of the text read and discussed was Strawberries by Glasgow late poet Edwin Morgan. Having already by then tested the therapeutical tool within a daycare unit in palliative care with residents of a care home as well, we also wanted to test it with the general public, and surprisingly, the results were actually very similar. So the conclusion could provisionally be that reading poetry aloud through PROSE, for example, a tool like another could be constructed, but reading poetry aloud followed by discussion and maybe evaluation as well, function as a tool of connection in different study populations, and can be of use not only in the context of illness, but also of community building, which reconducts our work and research back to Matz's definition of poetry therapy, which we read at the beginning. And let me just finish by the last photo. This is a photo of that day at the Beecher Theatre in I think it was the 9th of April of 2018, if I remember the day well, where we actually we're working together, and I'll just give you the very quick structure. We used evoke cards. Evoke cards are cards where you have an image and you have a feeling, like sadness or happy or, whatever, feeling angry, whatever. And, participants pick a card and an image that corresponds to how they're feeling then at the beginning of the workshop. Then we read the poem several times, and followed by discussion. And discussion actually did lead into storytelling, their own storytelling about their relatives, about, you know, we had a widow who was actually saying, this is the first time I'm talking about my grief, you know, from losing my husband, and what we did afterwards, you know. So people were actually really connected emotionally between each other. And then afterwards we worked with perfumes and scents and different materials to touch, so velvet and satin and wool, whatever, to craft a collage basing themselves on the discussion and on their storytelling. And then after that, we picked another evoke cards, and surprisingly, all of them, you know, had, through the way they were feeling at the end of the workshop, had picked an evoke card which was showing us that there had definitely been a lift in moods by the end of the workshop. And then obviously we evaluated it with evaluation forms as well, just to know what they felt about it. So, you know, even those evaluation forms can actually construct a bit of a narrative that can be used later, you know, as literature for medicine, narrative medicine. So I'd like to stop here, but I will continue developing the use of the poetic text as a tool in narrative medicine in my next lecture, which will take place on the 21st of April next month. We will look at the poetic text, why it is so powerful within the scope of narrative medicine, and through what theory we can study a population of patients, and also at real examples of poetic texts by selected Anglophone poets who actually maybe went through illness, and maybe also Anglophone physicians who wrote poetry in connection with illness. And so this is me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you to you, Rossella, for your interesting perspective and presentation on the topic. I think especially in relation to the practical aspects of your research and the work. So the attention to the patient, and also what I found inspiring was the role of voice in your method. But we will talk a little more about you and Cecilia and all the presentation at the end. So now it's time for me to present the other two speakers of this seminar that are Chiara Battisti and Sidia Fiorato from University of Verona, who are jointly working on a project, on disability studies. Chiara will start the presentation with an introduction on the topic of disability studies and their connection with narrative medicine, while Sidia will have a specific focus on the fairy tale in children's healthcare environments. So I will try to share again my screen. And let's Chiara talk.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Maela, and thank you, Cecilia and Rossella, for your wonderful presentation. In my short introduction, more than an introduction, it is an overview to disability studies and literature in connection with medical humanities. I will first of all focus on what disability studies are, and then I will consider the link between disability studies and literature, and then the connection between disability studies, literature, and medical humanities. The relationship between disability studies and medical humanities has been, in particular in the past, controversial, but now many critics are pointing out that there is a productive, extremely productive relationship between disability studies and medical humanities. So I would like to start by reading, and in this I take Rebecca's garden suggestion. Next slide, please. Yes. So I would like to start by reading a short passage from Kenny's Fried Disability Memoir, The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory. Next slide. I think it is worth spending a couple of words on the title before moving on to reading the passage. the history of my shoes and the evolution of Darwin's theory. Next slide.
Yes.
Yes, okay. The title anticipates that the author will tell us two stories, one connected with his shoes and the other to Darwin's theory. And indeed, Fries opened his memoir to the possibility of links intertwining the development of Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest and his orthopedic shoes. In so doing, Fries liberates himself from expected narrative frameworks that often support ableist hegemony. Fries' creative reappropriation of Darwin's theory allows him to recast his disability and his shoes in terms of variations and adaptation. And although only the fittest may survive, Fries learns that adaptation and variation are critical to survival. What is considered normal or even perfect is only a passing phase of the ever-changing embodiment of nature in our world. In the end, Darwin's theories resonates with Fries' own story, thus helping the readers understand that variety and difference are not only normal, but are the origins of survival itself. Next slide. And now let's go to the point. The memoir starts with the chapters titled Still Disabled, in which Fries describes his humiliating visit to a doctor, Dr. Mendotti, who is supposed to determine whether Fries is still entitled to disability-related benefits. Fries then, despite his impairment, doesn't seek medical care from this doctor, but help in obtaining government benefits. Let's consider Dr. Mendotti's reaction to Fries' congenital deformities. When Fries takes off his shoes and socks, the doctor, unable to provide a believable description of what he has in front of him, is reluctant to even use the term fit and questions Fries' ability to walk on those. Since in this particular situation, Fries depends on the doctor's judgment, Fries has no choice but to go through the procedure and to perform the idea of disability as normativized by ableist society. And in the next slide, we can read the quotation. I must not only go through being examined by a doctor who has never seen a body like mine before, but in this situation, I must act as if my disability is the worst thing that ever happened, when the truth is, this examination, Dr. Mendotti's stare, are much more difficult to endure. So this passage highlights at least three key elements. First of all, Fries argues that what in fact constitutes tragedy is not his physiological difference. On the contrary, this examination, Dr. Mendotti's stares, are much more difficult to endure. The second point is that Mendotti's surprise, whether it is empathetic or insensitive, reflects a larger cultural issue. Our cultural norms of ability ask to mask disability. Thus, disabled people often experience and must in some way address the surprise that the non-disabled express when encountering their difference. And third, as argued, Fries has not come to Dr. Mendotti for a cure, but rather for simple confirmation that he is still disabled, as the title of the chapter suggests. So Dr. Mendotti stands here for the medical power and the discursive authority of the doctors. The language of medicine and the doctor's account of disability pose a challenge to the disabled person narrative. While the patient's account may be considered as subjective and emotional, there is very often the idea that the doctor's account is objective and rational. So we can say that more generally, this passage underlines that what we call disability has historically been defined exclusively by medicine, in particular through the processes of diagnosis and care. Disabilities are identified with an attribute of the person against the defined standard of normality or ability. And disability studies play and have played a part, an important part, in questioning this identification. So what are disability studies? Disability studies have grown out of the cultural studies established in Great Britain in the 1970s and have little by little acquired the status of an academic discipline, thanks in particular to the work of British scholars such as Mike Oliver and Vic Finkelstein. Next slide. In the 1980s, they began to be recognized as a new stimulating critical approach by the Anglo-Saxon world, the United States, Australia, Northern Europe, and France. And although presented under one label, the name disability studies are indeed a diversified research field. The diversification of approach can be determined by the aim of the movement, that is to say, to modify the cultural paradigm through which the concept of disability is interpreted, using a research that involves many disciplinary fields, such as, for example, sociology, law, philosophy, literature, and psychology. Disability studies underline that there are two main models in terms of how disability is considered. Next slide. The social model and the medical model. Disability study analyze the society within which the disabled person lives, and they critically challenge the medical model that has suggested conceptualizations regarding disability as a specific problem of an individual, rather than looking more widely at society. The medical model looks at a person's impairment first and focuses on the impairment as the cause of disabled people being unable to participate fully in society. The medical model focuses on the impairment and what can be done to fix the disabled person. From the perception of the disability studies, we generally promote the social model, and this strong distinction between the social model and the medical model is at the very origin at the controversial relationship between disability studies and medical humanities. But so we are now considering the nuances of the medical model, and we are trying to not to consider the overemphasis of the social model, and this is the reason why we can talk about this productive relationship between disability studies and medical humanities. Anyway, from the perception of disability studies, disability can no longer be conceived as a deviation from normality, nor can the social experience of the disabled person be considered without taking into account the contextual factors causing their exclusion. In such a critical scrutiny, the distinction between impairment and disability is founding. Next slide. As stressed by Leonard Lewis, who is an important spokesperson for this critical movement, an impairment implies a biological, cognitive, sensorial, or physiological difference, whereas disability is the result of a negative social reaction to such a difference. So impairment is the real physical, mental condition, whereas disability is a social and political construction. To better understand the difference between impairment and disability, let's consider Susan Fiala's first-person narrative account of being a doctor with bipolar disorder. Fiala describes the pressure she felt to keep her illness as her deepest secret. Next slide. She remembers, "I have lived in fear that one day I will be unable to continue the pretense of being normal and will be found out. If my colleagues knew that I was bipolar, I fear I would never again be taken seriously, that I would be viewed as the impaired physician who, at a display of passion or emotion, would be seen as having an episode. My hard-earned credibility would be gone." In this case, suffering from bipolar disorder is the impairment, while the secrecy, isolation, and shame described by Fiala is the disability or part of it. Fiala instead makes clear that the impairment should be accepted for the ways in which it can enhance a clinician's professional skill. Next slide. "The illness has given me a compassion and sensitivity for others that has made me a better doctor." So, as you can see, the very concept of normality is a cultural construct. Next slide. The problem is not the person with disability. The problem is the way normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the disabled body, Davis argues. The study of disability's social stigma doesn't involve only its medical, legal, or sociological aspect, but also the representation of disability in historical, literary, and artistic perspectives. The analysis of disability within the context of humanity is in correspondence with the objectives of the social model, because it constitutes in itself, next slide, a way of resisting the idea that disability is a personal tragedy or a pathologized medical issue. Far from dealing with the silence and the absence of disabled as found in political and social life, literary texts return very frequently and with different perspectives to the theme of disability that becomes in turn an effective metaphor for the social anxiety, taking on, next slide, a defamiliarizing effect on the basic categories of identity and of literary criticism. As for this aspect, next slide, sorry. And also the other one. Okay. As for this aspect, Tobin Sieber, in his disability theories, argues for a link between instability, disability, and identity. He calls attention to how the presence of disability creates a different picture of identity, one less stable than the identities associated with gender, race, sexuality, nation, and class, and therefore presenting the opportunity to rethink how human identity works. Understanding and analyzing the cultural and literary representation through the critical lens of disability studies implies bringing into play alternative readings concerning concept of culture and power by analyzing, first of all, the notion of norm. Next slide. So what perspective can disability studies give to health humanities? According to Garden, the incorporation of disability studies into the medical humanities allows to contextualize the biomedical discourse, illuminating the social context of illness, of suffering, and of disability. The incorporation of disability studies perspectives can enlarge the theoretical foundation of the medical humanities by creating a critical framework for discussing the socio-economic forces that shape the individual account of disability and illness represented in narratives and in other literary texts, in other texts, such as, for example, films, videos, and visual arts. Through this critical engagement with narratives, clinicians can better understand the perspectives of people with disabilities, incorporate them into their practice, thus shifting the balance of power in the clinic. So now I leave the floor to Sidia and to the world of fairy tales.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to join Chiara's reflections and also Rossella's and Cecilia's reflections by underlining that the human context of suffering and healing can be expressed through literature and the arts, which allow us to understand health, illness, and care in relation to subjective experience. So within the context of the medical humanities and the cultural construction of well-being, a relevant field of research is represented by the presence of the fairy tale in children's healthcare environments. So first of all, a couple of considerations on the genre. So if we consider its characteristics, the fairy tales and the folk tales from which the fairy tale derive, they can be said to stage a narrative understanding of people's selves, narratives by which they represent the protagonist's condition and identity in the world and in their specific society. So they are interpretations of their life within the community. Then we know that when from the folk tales we pass to the fairy tales, the narratives acquired a specific educational function, and they became carriers of the different periods' specific ideologies and codified social behavior. So they promoted normalized models for social belonging. They aimed at guiding people to cope with complex personal issues in everyday life, and they focus in particular on the relationship between the self and the world. They metaphorically expressed and still express individual issues and needs, which acquire a specific relevance in the case of the sick self, a self that is rendered other by the social context. So they become particularly relevant if we start to consider them as human responses to illness. And we can try and understand how illness affects the sense of identity, both of the protagonists and of the readers. So, and now we come to this slide. As Mitchell and Snyder observe, the very need for a story, still the previous one, thank you, sorry, Mela. As Mitchell and Snyder observe, the very need for a story is called into being when something has gone amiss with the known world. And thus, the language of a tale seeks to comprehend that which has stepped out of line. Fairy tales address deep truths of life, feelings, questions, fears, and doubts. When we tell a child a fairy tale, we offer images that the child can recognize in its own struggle with illness and death, loss and separation. The fairy tale takes the child's fears and dilemmas seriously and tackles them directly. For example, the need that someone cares for it, the will to live, and the fear of death. Fairy tales thus offer relief by giving shape to unconscious fears, sometimes without the child being conscious of it. Fairy tales focus on the child's psychological and developmental dilemmas. Now, in the case of a sick child, the child is often unable to express his anxiety and ask information about his condition. So the family is a mediator between the patient and the doctor. As some critics underlined, it is important to avoid that children remain without a space to express, to share, and make meaning of illness. And stories are a central aspect of children's lives. So, given this, and given the central role of narrative to interpret experience, the child can identify with the protagonists of the stories according to his or her specific story. So emotional aspects connected to his condition enter his or her consciousness and are processed by the imagination. Thus, they can become tolerable, also through invented symbolic personalities. The happy ending introduces an element of hope, but only after the successful facing of the adventures and therefore the overcoming of difficult situations on the part of the protagonists. Some critics have observed that the happy ending can also not become the reality. Next slide, please. And I would like now to present a workshop described by Adamo and other critics, carried out in a pediatric cancer ward in Italy, which exploited the features of the fairy tale. In particular, they devoted a whole room for the workshop. So it wasn't devoted to any other kind of activity. It was just for this workshop for the children. So this symbolized the narrative space and the space for a constitution, the gathering of the community of children. So this was represented an element of social life they were deprived of, given their hospitalized condition and given also their health problems. Then a storyteller was included in this community, whose task was to tell the traditional stories, also the stories the children were already familiar with. And the children then were asked to respond to these stories through drawings. In this way, so we find here in a room the specific features of the genre, because the tale passed from the storyteller to the children, and it was carried on, interpreted and carried on. The children used the features that struck them the most to define their condition and or to reflect upon their current specific circumstances. For example, and we can go to the next slide, please. Invasive medical exams and the reaction to this condition and the reaction to listening to the famous story of the Emperor's Nightingale was, for example, that a child made this drawing where the protagonist, so the symbolical nightingale, asks the emperor, so probably an adult figure, a figure of authority, to let him fly away free, in freedom. Or sometimes, in some drawings, the stepmothers were identified with the doctors. So, a social microcosm was thus created, where the young patients could transform their emotional background thanks to the sharing with others. A similar outcome was observed by the critic Margherita and others during a workshop instead of invented tales. So here the process was brought one step further, and the children took the characteristic formulas and the protagonists in order to create their own stories. And they found out, likewise, that the narrative brings together emotional aspects, feelings, and images that speak on various levels about the group, their relationship, and the context in a psychodynamic way. The same elements could be relevant in case of young adults who can then resort to writing in order to express their condition as well as their related fears and anxieties. Therefore, the fairy tale can become a template for young hospitalized patients to express the reflections on their own sense of self, an instrument to cope with reality, as well as a source for doctors to enter the subjective world of the young patients. The narratives can inform the doctor-patient relationship and represent a way to transcend specific health issues, engaging the fantasy of the young hospitalized patients. The doctors enter the narrative, next slide, please. The doctors enter the narrative community and need the narrative competence to follow the young patient's narrative thread, their figural and symbolical language, to grasp the significance of the stories told, and to imagine the illness from its conflicting perspectives. This is also a very important opening in the case of children who do not master all the functions of language, the communicative functions of language, and therefore it is opening up to their way of communicating. And I would like to end this brief presentation with the next slide. That is, that are pictures of the hospital in Edinburgh, that's called the Edinburgh's New Sick Kids Hospital, that was recently renovated and is going to open next week on March the 23rd. And as you can see from the picture on the right, on my right, they renovated it in a fairy tale style, precisely to create this kind of atmosphere for children and to revise also the perception of the place for the young hospitalized patients. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sidia, and thank you, Chiara, for your huge presentation, and also for especially for having shared with us some aspect of your project. I hope to have the opportunity to go deeply on it in future, maybe in a new seminar or in a new appointment. So thank you again. As you know, we scheduled more or less 1.5 hours for our seminar, but we just want to have a short Q&A section, also because we have one question from the audience, from the public, and then so maybe we can just have 10 minutes more or 15 minutes maximum more. Of course, during this appointment. And I want to start with the question from Silvia Casini, who's who now is not here with us, but who asked me to read her question. And it is for you, Cecilia. I don't know if you read it in the chat.
Yes, I did. Yeah, but yeah, I will just for the other participants, Sylvia, she asked if I wonder whether in narrative medicine, medical humanities, we need to foreground the role played by visual film as a visual rather than just as a narrative object, as an embodied perceptual experience that is also multi-sensual, which has an affective quality. Absolutely.
Yes, I copy the question for everybody, so they.
Okay. Sorry. I agree absolutely, and curacy narrative medicine allows for this in a way that other more closed approaches do not allow. Actually, as I was listening to all of the presentations, I could hear the tools of narrative medicine in use. Because when we talk about the narrative in film, we are talking about the story that is conveyed through various media. A very, very curious thing happened in the last. We have a curricular unit for that's open for masters and PhD students, but also other professionals can attend. But that's an aside. And one of the PhD students was actually blind. And I didn't realize, because we were doing over Zoom, and I thought, this is so. And when she was actually writing her text, because of the context, she described the body language of one of the characters that we were actually working with. So from the other aspects of the film, she actually conveyed she had written a kind of a poem, and the poem was a description of the body language of the character she had not seen, which was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. Now, one of the things when we work with narrative medicine, with film, there's a slight, we have to be careful of one thing, which is the post-production editing, which can be used to create specific or overemphasize specific effects. So when we are looking at if we remove excessive elements of post-production editing, we can certainly work with the whole sensory film, and you can use the tools of close reading, reflective writing, where we create our own narrative from what we're observing. So absolutely, it can be used in this way. And even as Maura Spiegel reflects, it also it creates an awareness of changes in affect and on the characters, which are being produced to produce an effect. And so definitely it's a multi-level, multi-layer process.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. She's not here, so we hope so. But I don't know if if other speakers want to add something on this topic. Maybe also because I think that the aspect of reflection, of the self-reflection, was touched also by Rossella, for example. But can be also a topic interesting according disability studies and children. I don't know how children reflect on themselves.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. I wonder if maybe we could write an answer for Silvia Casini, and we could send it to her by email, so she has her answer. Maybe
yes.
after
yes.
or something.
She told us that she will be in touch with us and also see the recording of the seminar when we will upload it on our YouTube channel and on our website.
And also,
for everybody.
I also wanted to add something to what Cecilia was saying, that absolutely agree with Cecilia and their answer, and also the question by Silvia Casini. And that's exactly one of the areas that overlaps with poetry, because poetry is made by images. So there is that affect, sort of effect. I'm sorry, apologies for the, but you know, the poetry, like film, creates images, and they're images that are, you know, obviously film is more immediate in a way because it goes beyond language. It can be seen by anyone. It's more universal, while poetry has to be understood via language. But once the poem has been understood via the language, or a translation of whatever language into another language, then you actually have a series of images next to each other. It's a bit like a montage of images, just like film. So I would say that both poetry and film have very similar but different, of course, different. Also, film has rhythm like poetry, so they're both. And I will go a little bit deeper into this in the next time. But yeah, that's what I meant to add. Yeah.
I can only add that we will devote a session to graphic novels and disability studies, medical humanities. So there will be plenty of time for me to speak about the role of images in another nuance, that is to say, the one of the graphic novels as connected with disability studies and medicine.
Okay, Sidia. Yes.
Yes. Can I say
yes,
something?
Yes, Sidia, and then Marijike. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry for my pronunciation.
What Cecilia says, you know, the language of images and music, and or languages that touch the person as a whole, but on a more unconscious level. And I would agree with Carmela that it is also very important to know how to translate, or to try to translate, or approaches to translation of all these impressions and these unconscious understandings into a more articulate understanding. I think all words and language and music and rhythm and images are not opposed. They are all part of you know, of knowledge. And I think that language as a means of reflection remains very, very important. And when I see younger people who go very much into film and music, which I I think that perhaps it is necessary not to ignore and not to neglect a linguistic training, a training in language, a training in how to, for instance, say what they see. You know, let's speak about an image, or I think this is important. Just that. Thank you.
Maybe Sidia wanted to add something on the topic.
No,
Sidia. Yes, also Sidia. Sorry, Cecilia. Okay. Because she was trying to answer before, and then.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Sidia.
No, don't worry.
No problem. No problem. Just a final comment, of course, on the importance of images for children. That in the first workshop that these critics that I described, by these critics, they were asked to draw. So the image that conveyed their emotions, so the elaboration of their emotions and their anxieties. Therefore, I can only agree. I just wanted to say this. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if we have any other question from the audience. Therefore, I have one for all of you, just one because of timing problems. So it is a general question for all the speakers, because it seems to me that medical humanities occurred to underline also the problem of power in the patient-physician relationship, trying to balance this displacement by reflecting on a sociological approach of the issues linked to the disease of the human body. So what do you think about this? Would you like to add something on this role and the power of role of physician and the role of patient in this relationship? Do you want to go deeply just a little bit on this aspect? You can start. I don't know who, but it's okay.
I can start if you want.
Yes, for
so
sure.
I would add the name. So in my presentation, I have mentioned Dr. Mendotti's stare, and I have pointed out that it is a normative stare. And in this sense, I would add the name of Michel Foucault, and in particular the birth of the clinic, in which Foucault describes how doctors modify the patient's stories, fitting the story into a biomedical paradigm, filtering out non-biomedical material. And in this sense, Foucault underlines how the gaze, the medical gaze, is an act of selecting what we consider to be the relevant element of the total data stream available to our senses. So this is the reason why I would like only to mention the name of Foucault and the idea of gaze and medical gaze, which is full of power. It is an eye, the medical one, which knows, decides, governs.
Mm-hmm. It also defines.
Yes.
Because in disability study, physician and doctors.
Yeah, and the key is Foucault's charge is that the doctors are doctors-oriented, non-patient-oriented, and narrative medicine help us to be perhaps more patient-oriented.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it is one of the areas, I think, which the fact that it opens the perception to open the gaze to hear other stories. And one of the very first narrative medicine studies we did with medical students and humanities students. And actually it was really an amazing experience, because there suddenly became awareness of both sides. And some of the responses, but then it was the master's student who was, it was part of our dissertation. And there was a change in both attitudes, because, for instance, when she then did the interviews with the groups afterwards, in individual groups, the humanities students said things like, I will be more attentive to what I say. You know, so there, which was an interesting kind of, so there is the power structure, but also there suddenly became awareness on the part of the humanities students that the doctor does not know everything. And this reminds me a little bit about Miranda Fricker's theory of epistemic injustice. One of the examples that she uses of credibility excess is applied actually to the medical situation, where the patient expects the doctor to know, so that there is a credibility excess. So the balance of power is an unbalanced balance. It's an unbalanced balance of power, and which the excess is also it's also not good. And so anyway, that's just my short answer. But definitely what happens with narrative medicine, allowing an expansion, anything I think that allows an expansion of the awareness of the other, it's going to help in power, deconstruct power structure.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Yeah, can I ask a question to the persons who are dealing in disability studies? For instance, the question of power is central to the debate, but it has many aspects. I can't go into it now, but imagine a person with a disability that has no access to language or has no access to symbol formation, yes? And who can only spoken of by others, yes? has, for instance, the parents of this child or this adult person, or doctors of a person who is in a coma, who has been in a coma for many years, how can they speak of their child? How can they speak of their patient without violating the integrity of the person? How, another question, another verse, how to exercise power well? And I think that's a more important question than discussing the necessary power relationship between a doctor and a patient.
I think that there are different parts that are important to be considered in this case, which is extremely important because, as you said, it deals with children, with parents who have to speak for their children, but also if we speak, for example, I work on Alzheimer, for the caregiver of Alzheimer's people. And it is, so there is a huge debate on this part of using, of interpreting the self of a person who is not able to express herself or himself. So perhaps it can be the argument for another session, but yes, it is important. It is important to consider the relation of power between the doctors and the patient, and it is also important to consider the problems connected with speaking for another person.
Yes, that's it.
And respecting the identity of the other person, but knowing that a part of this identity is in a sense at least fragmented.
Thank you. I think that's a good answer. Yes.
Okay, I don't know if anybody will want to add something on this question. No, so it's time for us to end this interesting seminar. What I found used today was, in this conversation, was the attempt to find alternative ways to observe the medicalization and also the patient condition. So a topic that I think it's really interesting, not only for scholars or a general audience, but also for healthcare professionals. So I hope this introduction could be useful also for you to prepare to next appointments. So for you, audience, for you that are here attending this seminar, next appointment in which we will go through these issues with the expert in specific areas. So don't forget to join us during our next appointment with Rossella on April 21. Rossella Riccobono will talk about poetry therapy and storytelling. So really thank you for having been here. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.